So Harris, really nice to see you again. Thanks for coming on. You've been covering the gun control debate that's going on in Capitol Hill right now. Where does that really stand? I know that Senator Chris Murphy from Connecticut was looking for 10 Republicans who were going to come together on some kind of compromise bill on gun control legislation. What are you seeing?
Yeah, well, so obviously right now there's been kind of more of a consensus on what's not going to be in a potential compromise deal than what's actually going to be in. There are three areas where both Democrats and Republicans are still negotiating. One of those is enhancing background checks, potentially by giving federal and state local resources access to sealed juvenile records. A lot of lawmakers believe that could potentially be key to preventing future mass shootings, because a lot of these shootings are carried out by males in the 18 to 21 range, and usually there's significant procedural issues that come up in their background, but because the way the courts seal juvenile records, those aren't necessarily enough to prohibit them from getting a gun. Red flag laws are another thing, which essentially wouldn't necessarily be a national red flag law, just incentivize states to adopt red flag measures. Those are orders that courts can give to prohibit someone from possessing a gun or purchasing a gun if they're deemed dangerous. There's a lot of procedural issues there with, specifically with gun rights advocates talking about due process, because they fear that essentially, anyone with an axe to grind against their neighbor or an ex-girlfriend, is going to be able to go and get one of these orders of protection, have someone's gun seized from them, and then the burden of proof is going to fall on the gun owner rather than on the person who is making the claims that they are a danger. And the other potential line of compromise here is going to be around school safety issues. Senator Graham and a few other lawmakers are looking at ways in which they can potentially streamline the process to allow veterans to be school safety officers. But this is very much all lukewarm type of stuff. This isn't necessarily a massive gun control package, although some parts of it are very controversial. As of right now, though, it's probably like 50-50 or 60-40 that a deal is not going to happen, but we'll see what ends up occurring later this week.
Yeah, I mean, are those measures that they've talked about before when they have these kind of debates, or is there really anything new here? You said it was kind of lukewarm, but is there really any nuance to this time around?
Well, I think the what's different this time around is obviously the Uvalde shooting has kind of opened up some wounds on Capitol Hill this morning. One of the survivors, a young 11-year-old girl who actually survived the shooting by smearing the blood of a classmate on herself and playing dead, testified. And a lot of lawmakers feel very, very emotional that now is a time to act. A lot of these proposals have been around. There isn't really anything significantly new. Senator Graham has supported a way to incentivize states to adopt red flag laws for quite a bit of time. They've always talked about enhancing background checks. There are always ways in which they're looking to enhance background checks. They did something similar a few years ago during the Trump administration. They've been trying to do it since the early 2010s as well. The only kind of issue that's kind of new is hardening schools and boosting school security. But I mean, none of this stuff is well out of the realm of political mainstream. The only issue is this going to be able to actually happen? And right now it doesn't necessarily seem like. A lot of people also think that for the most part, both sides are just looking at, putting the show of doing something because there is a very, very contentious midterm election coming up. Democrats want to be able to mobilize their base. They want to be able to go into suburban communities and say, hey, we tried to do something on gun control. We didn't get what we wanted, but vote for us and we'll ban assault weapons. And Republicans also want to go into these suburban communities and say, hey, we don't want to ban assault weapons, but, we are taking measures that are going to protect your children, that are going to protect communities from gun violence, but then also, that aren't going to infringe on anyone's rights. So there's a lot of political movement at play. And, in all honesty, if this wasn't an election year and if so many suburban seats weren't in contention, I think a lot of people would be wondering whether or not this debate would be as long and as strong as it has been recently.
Sure. And that's what I kind of wanted to talk about more, is how this really plays into the midterm elections. Obviously, Democrats have control of, all the levers of power in Washington right now. They've got the House, the Senate, and the White House. But they don't really have too much to show for what they've done in the past 2 years in power. All they really have are, spending packages, a COVID package, and the infrastructure package. Those are both spending packages at a time where inflation is, at record heights. It's going through the roof. And I mean, I'm looking at some recent polling here from Scott Rasmussen, showing that inflation is, is at the top of everyone's minds. It's, the most prevalent issue that Americans care about right now. And if the only two things they can really show that they've worked on or, actually passed are things that have made that problem worse, do you think there's more of an impetus for Democrats to show that they're doing something on stuff like gun control or, with Dobbs versus Jackson's coming out, there might be a ruling striking down Roe. Are they kind of trying to go to their base and play up issues that will get their folks to the polls?
Absolutely. I mean, we've seen that play out time and time again. This Congress, Senator Schumer has a tendency to put up bills that he knows are going to fail. They had a bill on codifying Roe versus Wade only 3 weeks ago that failed, had no chance of passing, but they put it up there because they wanted to get Republicans on the record so they can go, to the stump in November and say, hey, look, that other side wants to ban abortion or that other side doesn't want to protect abortion. And there are absolutely issues like that. And I think right now the impetuous, as we've seen in the House, is to, showcase that, hey, we are doing something. They're voting on a lot of messaging bills. The House later tonight is going to be voting on a gun control package that has no chance of becoming law in the Senate, but they're still voting on it anyway because they want to set the record straight for where they stand. It's similar stuff they're doing on inflation as well, as you mentioned. There's been this whole big push by the House Oversight Committee and other panels to hold big companies accountable for quote unquote price gouging. They're essentially saying that, hey, we're not responsible for spending our way into inflation. In reality, the big companies and your local gas chains are your local gas stations are actually the ones who are raising prices on you. They're taking advantage of a crisis. So there's absolutely these messaging bills that are going on right now, and I think Democrats are worried. I mean, the Virginia governor's race last year was a state that Biden had won by 10, and that incoming Governor Glenn Youngkin won by flipped and won by 2 points. That was a 12-point swing. Yeah, there are a lot more races in the country that are significantly more marginal than 12 points.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, that was even before, inflation really got going. I mean, it's been rising for the past couple of years, but it didn't really get bad until, a couple months ago. But that Virginia race was really more on stuff like, CRT and parental choice, public safety, I think was there. Those things all, especially like public safety. After inflation, crime's one of the issues that really is up there on Americans' minds that they care a lot about. And I don't think Democrats really have much to offer for it besides saying, oh, well, we didn't actually say to fund the police. That's not what we meant. Do you see that too?
Yeah, obviously, I mean, Congress isn't really pushing a big, a big law and order package. One of the things that they were considering on doing was, figuring out a way to legalize or, decriminalize marijuana federally, and that essentially stalled because, rising crime rates are a factor. They're essentially trying to repackage some of these gun control measures as also fighting crime, but the voters aren't buying it. I mean, as we saw earlier this week, in super liberal, progressive San Francisco, one of the most liberal areas in the country, voters decided to recall this far left radical district attorney who essentially, had decided that he was going to abolish, all, prosecuting all crime in
pro-crime, yeah,
kind of insane. So, crime is definitely a focus. I think that's one of the things where Democrats are very, very weak on. It's one of the things where federally they don't have a proper response to. I think the way that you view that response isn't necessarily by the things they're proposing. It's by the things they put on the back burner. So marijuana legalization is one of them. There was a bill that would narrow the cocaine and the crack disparity that's gone into the Senate. It might come up for a vote this year, but I think a lot of Democrats are very, very concerned that, no matter if they vote on these, criminal justice policies, that someone's going to ding them by saying, well, hey, you're letting offenders out of prison. Sure. And that is a big, big factor in this election cycle. And I think, look, it's a very, very tough time to be a Democrat. And there are a lot of issues even prior to inflation that they were kind of struggling to respond to. And inflation has only made that situation significantly worse.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, you were talking about just last night with some of these primaries in California. You saw the was this Chesa Boudin in San Francisco going down there. A lot of the typical, folks that make up, the Democratic coalition, especially a lot of minority voters like Asian Americans and Hispanics, really, turned out against them last night. I mean, there's got to be warning signs all over for Democrats headed into the November midterms that, it's really just become a party of, affluent white, coastal voters here.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, that San Francisco DA's race, the recall referendum was, probably the biggest indicator of that. The only places where this guy actually, did well was the affluent white neighborhoods that, weren't necessarily being targeted by crime. But, Asian Americans,
Mm-hmm.
Hispanic Americans, African Americans in San Francisco were fed up with it because proportionally they are the victims of crime because, they can't afford to live in Tony areas where, they've got private security guards walking around, or, the police are more likely to respond because that area, has significantly more commercial wealth.
Yeah.
There are inequities in that system that aren't fair. And I think a lot of minority voters are coming around on that. We saw it with the defund the police rhetoric too. There are urban municipalities all across this country that are kind of starting to fall back on that. And, most of that is, really being pushed by minority communities because, again, they are more prevalently victimized by crime. But I think there are a lot of red flags coming up for Democrats. I mean, we've got some interesting House races, special elections in both the Texas and the New York suburbs. They're going to be up this summer. Those are going to be really, really, really big alarm sounds as to whether or not Democrats are going to be able to keep the House majority. But I mean, it's not looking good for the party right now. And again, they don't really necessarily have any sort of message. And even if they do get this gun control package, this bipartisan compromise through, it's probably not going to be significantly enough to, mobilize voters because,
Sure.
a lot of these Democrats want to ban assault weapons. They're not even talking about banning assault weapons. They're talking about enhancing some background check. This is potentially going to be a boon for Republican voters and congressional Republican candidates because in those suburbs are going to say, well, hey, we did something. We're not infringing on your rights, but we are taking the issue of security very, very seriously, and Democrats aren't going to be able to compete with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, we've got to see how that plays out. But Haris, thanks for coming on. Really interesting to talk with you.
Always a pleasure, Peter. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thanks.